Good morning to those of you in Australia and good afternoon to those watching from the United States. As the U.S. Ambassador to Australia, I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar marking the 15th anniversary of the entry into force of the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement. I'd prefer to be with you in real time, but I am currently en route to Washington, D.C. for the Australia-U.S. ministerial consultations, which I anticipate will be one of the most consequential AUSMENs to date. I can't tune in live, but I do look forward to watching afterwards. In the meantime, I would like to recognize and thank our speakers for sharing their insights with us today. Many of you were here at the inception, and you deserve our praise. I'd like to express particular appreciation to former Prime Minister John Howard, Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos, Joe Hockey, Wendy Cutler, Michael Thawley, and of course my good friend and former Reagan-Bush administration colleague Bob Zoellick. Much has changed in the past 15 years since you lent your good judgment and foresight to this worthwhile endeavor. And indeed, much has changed over the past 6 months. But something that will not change is the United States' position as Australia's most important economic partner. Indeed, the day before I boarded the plane in Sydney, I was honored to join Trade Minister Simon Birmingham at an AmCham-sponsored event to roll out a comprehensive report by Deloitte, showcasing the depth and breadth of the United States economic relationship. That report had some impressive statistics. None is more impressive than this. Trade and investment from the United States contributes about 7% to Australia's gross domestic product each year. That's $131 billion, roughly the size of Australia's mining sector. The United States is the single largest source of foreign investment in Australia by far. There's a reason for this, and it is more than just good business sense. Our dynamic economic partnership is built on trust and shared values, rule of law, transparency, hard work, and fair play. 15 years ago, American and Australian leaders saw an opportunity to advance this partnership, and they took it. Today, even as the future seems unpredictable, we have another opportunity to advance this partnership. Productivity gains from innovative R&D, high-paying jobs for hardworking Australians, education and knowledge exchanged and gained. U.S. investment is critical to Australia's future prosperity. We are working together hard to secure critical mineral supply chains, on frontier technology and space exploration, and on building up the economic resilience of our countries and our region. America is too great for small dreams, and so is Australia. As we look forward toward rebuilding our economies, the United States is proud to be Australia's most important economic partner. Thank you.
AB, who's a fine gentleman, continues a long line of distinguished ambassadors from the United States to Australia. Wendy Cutler was, instrumental in helping to promote the United States position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I enjoyed working with her for a very short period of time. But we were on the same page. We both believed in free trade. We both believed in helping to encourage others to come on board, but the politics was beating us all. Wendy, from both your perspective as a very senior US trade negotiator, but also as Vice President of the Asia Society, where to now for free trade here in the United States?
Thank you very much for inviting me to join such a distinguished panel of people who work so hard on the Us Australia Fta. It's hard to believe that we're in the teenage years of such an important agreement. I was earlier, I think it was Ambassador Thawley mentioned about working with Bob Zoellick and how he just worked so hard. And you probably thought he was just focusing on you. But I can tell you, being at USTR when he was negotiating this agreement, he was juggling so many balls, but yet he could keep his eye on everyone. And he always had, I think, a special place in his heart for the US Australia FTA. So I'm going to talk more about kind of looking forward and what the US and Australia can do in the region and globally going forward. I think some people might ask, well, why don't we just work on updating our FTA? It's 15 years old. We did this with Canada and Mexico. We did it with Korea. Maybe we should update the US-Australia FTA. Well, I would advise against that for a number of reasons. I think as we've learned with the USMCA, it's a very time-consuming process. And I'm not sure at the end of the day with Australia if those gains would even be worth it. And second, I think in any renegotiation or updating of this agreement, we would probably encounter some trade frictions, which I really don't think is in our common interest, given all the shared objectives we have for the region and globally. And finally, and this is my point, I think we need to really be thinking about how we can take our partnership and set new standards for the region, work together to create an alternative model to that state-led model, and work together to reform the WTO. So with that in mind, looking ahead, I wanted to offer kind of 5 concrete suggestions of work that we can do together going forward, which I think would be incredibly valuable. The first area where I think it's very promising for bilateral work, and I understand under deep conversation between our 2 governments, is working on a digital trade agreement. Australia recently concluded a bilateral digital trade agreement with Singapore. We have forward-leaning provisions in the USMCA on digital trade, as with Japan. There are other regional deals in the region in place in this area. And I think this would be a very promising area. So I hope our 2 governments in the coming weeks can work hard and launch those talks, and they can move forward quickly. And then we can work with all these other partners and kind of thread all these agreements together in some kind of regional digital trade agreement. Second, with respect to China, your largest trading partner, I think right now it may be our first or second largest trading partner. It changes every day between Canada, Mexico, and China. I think there's important work we need to do together here. And my specific recommendation would be for Australia to seriously consider joining the EU and Japan and the United States in its trilateral work on industrial subsidies, forced technology transfer, and other issues. We've come a long way with the EU and Japan. All 3 parties now are working to bring other countries on board. And I hope Australia would seriously consider this, and the US would make a stronger effort to bring Australia on board at senior levels. Third, in the investment area, and I have to say, I knew two-way investment had increased dramatically over the past 15 years, but I hadn't realized it actually tripled, because I always remember from 15 years ago that investment was probably one of the most difficult issues in the negotiation. I think now we have shared interest in investment, particularly with respect to coordinating on our investment regimes, both with respect to screening and restrictions and looking at third-party investments. The United States, we updated our CFIUS legislation last February. We are now implementing our new regulations. I know Australia has made some revisions to their agreement. We have shared interest here. And I think by sharing our experiences, our what's working, what's not working, where there are loopholes, which entities we should be looking at, I think this is an area that's very fruitful for cooperation. Fourth, WTO reform is an area we have many shared interests. The WTO is under serious strain. Some say it's in crisis. We can work together with respect to selecting the new Director General. We can work together. We are already working together in a number of areas like transparency and e-commerce. But again, I think we can really step up our cooperation, and I think it's really needed now in the WTO because of the strain the organization is under. And finally, I would be remiss as someone who worked on the TPP for many years not to raise this issue. I think at some point, and I stress at some point because I don't think we're ready now, that we should work with Australia to figure out, is there a way back for the United States to some sort of TPP? I don't think it can be the same agreement. Frankly, it would need updates, it would need revisions, but I think it would be a useful conversation to have. And I'm hoping that regardless of who wins our next election, that with time, our government will realize that there was a lot to this agreement, and it made a lot of sense with respect to our regional objectives. And I would just conclude in saying our partnership with Australia was so critical to getting the TPP concluded. So with that, thank you very much. I think there's a lot we can do going forward, particularly with respect to the region and to global trade.
Wendy, we've seen a breakup of multilateral agreements in recent times. And to be fair, the United States has led the charge in the breakup or failure to join a number of multilateral negotiations. Would it be any different under Joe Biden to what it is under President Trump? I mean, they are both, because, you know, what struck me was President Obama couldn't deliver the TPP, and both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were opposed to the TPP, and there was a strong stream right through, particularly the American Midwest, in opposition to any further trade agreements. So if it's difficult to negotiate a bilateral agreement or a trilateral agreement, how on earth could the US lead or be a part of a multilateral agreement?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, I can't speak, you know, for the Biden campaign, but I will say, if you read what he's saying, he is placing a premium on multilateral cooperation and working with our allies and partners in all areas, including trade. And perhaps because we have become so inward looking, people in the United States are beginning to realize that perhaps this is not in our interest. And if you look at polling on trade in the United States, there is support for re-engaging on trade globally, as well as just generally for free trade. So I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not saying this is going to happen anytime soon. But I think at some point, people may come around to recognizing the benefits of TPP. It was not perfect by any means, but there were a lot of benefits that accrued to the United States and to the region, particularly as we look ahead and we see, you know, where the region is headed.
And countries have often used, Wendy, tariffs and quotas to, you know, as tools to deliver domestic political support. Do you think it's any different now to what it was in the past? Previous presidents have imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium. There's always been a constant battle, particularly on aluminium with Canada, but there's been numerous examples where they've weaponized economics in order to try and win political support domestically, particularly amongst key interest groups. Do you think that's going to change as the world becomes smaller and particularly retail commerce becomes more prevalent?
Well, I think you raise a good point. We're headed more and more to a digital trade world and to a services trade world. And there, of course, tariffs are not the tool. But that said, I think, you know, any government can find tools in those areas to weaponize trade. But I think what you're seeing on tariffs and quotas is just a growing frustration in the United States about how, about our position and the benefits that we've accrued from trade. But perhaps, and this may be the silver lining, that because we've imposed so many tariffs, I think, and American interests are really hurting from these tariffs, perhaps, this can lead people to realize that tariffs are not in our interest. And perhaps what we need to do is to engage more with our trading partners and find solutions instead of just closing our borders and making it more difficult to trade with us.
Bob Zoellick, from your perspective as both the former president of the World Bank and as a senior political and economic figure here in the United States, you would have observed that international trade actually was slowing even before the new tariffs were introduced by the president here, or even before there was disruption to the global economy. Had the world exhausted its capacity to cop the politics of free trade? Or do you think, what is it going to take to bring free trade back to improve the prosperity of the everyday person? Sorry, you're muted as well. Yeah.
Let me start with an Australian-US story. Back in 1947, I've just finished a book, and so I went back and looked at this area. When the GATT was being created, original 23 countries, it almost fell apart because the US Congress passed a big increase in the wool tariff. And Australia threatened to pull out. And if Australia went, Britain would have gone. If Britain went, the Europeans would have gone. So the American negotiator, Will Clayton, actually came back to see Harry Truman. And Harry Truman gave him 15 minutes, and he gave the Secretary of Agriculture 15 minutes. And the Secretary of Agriculture said, if you don't accept this wool tariff bill, you're going to lose up to 7 states in the 1948 election. And Will Clayton said, look, we really need to be able to veto this bill. And if you can, lower the wool tariff so I can get this GATT going so we can actually shape something for the international trading system. And that's what Harry Truman did. He vetoed the bill and he authorized a small cut. Australia, as is typical, wanted more, but nevertheless, it was enough to sort of get us going. My point is, this depends on political leadership and it depends on political courage. So you are certainly right that the trading system, in terms of manufactured trade, it was actually slowing down from 2008 on. The services trade was going quite significantly, and is always the case in the trade area. You're going to get shifts regionally, and you're going to get shifts based on technology like 3D printing. Obviously, in the Asia Pacific, a lot of it was driven by China's changes, sort of moving up the value-added curve, moving away from some of the traditional commodities, different supply and logistics chains. Supply and logistics chains were changing because it was based less on labor market arbitrage and more on sort of digital platforms. So a second point would be the system is always evolving and both our countries have to keep up with it. And third, since Australians like straight talk, I'll be straight with you on politics. If Trump's reelected, you're not going to do anything on trade here because he's a protectionist. He said he's a protectionist in his inauguration, and he said he's a tariff man. So you dealt with it. And so frankly, it was the strength of the Australian relationship that shielded you from all the other stuff that people have had to deal with. But let's take the Biden administration, because I think that's going to be the real issue here. If Biden's elected, he's going to have a very full plate. He's got pandemic, he's got economic recovery, he's got racism and sense of inequality, he's got global climate change. And frankly, there's only so much that a US president can take on. That could move the trade agenda a little bit back unless Australia and others figure out a way to connect his domestic agenda with the trade and international agenda. So in addition to the digital trade that sort of Wendy mentioned, I would look to see whether there's ways, whether with biological security and pandemic, whether there's ways on sort of environmental issues that we can upgrade sort of global cooperation. And I think there's a chance here because a lot of the Biden staff are going to be well disposed towards sort of international relationships, but they have to manage their politics. And so whether it's Australia, whether it's the UK, Canada, Mexico, other friends, I actually think there's an opportunity if you look at their constraints and try to figure out how you can move this agenda going forward. And Wendy mentioned the other one. I'm not in agreement with the administration's policies towards China, which I don't think are producing anything for us other than confrontation. But as she pointed out, if there's a possibility to work with the US on some of the reasonable complaints about state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer, in the WTO, some of the issues such as special and differential treatment, how the dispute settlement system works, there's a chance that you could help bring the United States back into it. And this is where, frankly, Australia has got more leverage than anybody, because you're trusted as a friend. You're respected, and you've kind of earned your spurs. And so I'd be thinking now, if Biden get elected, how you can try to work with them, given their constraints, to help fix what's been quite a mess.
Prime Minister, thanks, Bob. Prime Minister, the United States hasn't faced hasn't faced really since the British back in the 1700s and early 1800s. They haven't faced a twin threat of an economic challenger and a military challenger from one single country until now. China is both a military challenger to the United States and also an economic challenger to the United States supremacy. Within that framework, is there any hope that we can have common values across the entire world that still support free trade, when you as an astute political observer know that you can't do anything if you're not in government?
Well, my response to that, Joe, is to some degree in certain circumstances, but you're not going to get some silver bullet that delivers an enthusiastic return to globalisation and completely free trade. You're not, because there have been too many transgressors to be found in all sorts of countries. I mean, China's a transgressor. China may go to the World Economic Forum in Davos and say, we are the new standard bearers of free trade. Give me a break. But having said that, whenever I'm asked to talk about the subject, I encourage Australians to remember how important China is to us as an export destination. So I don't think you're ever going to go back entirely to that, seen historically now as something of a golden period of globalisation. The first 10 or so years of the 21st century was really quite remarkable. And we've got to remember that it covered a period in which more people were lifted out of poverty than at any time since the Industrial Revolution. Now, do I think America faces the twin challenge of a country economically strong like China and military? Yes, that's an interesting historical comment. As long as we remember, of course, that China's got a few problems. We think the United States has problems. China has a demographic problem of immense proportions. And eventually there will be some kind of denouement inside China, with a growing section of the population who are born into affluence are going to wrestle with being told what to do. Now, there's no sign of it at the moment, because you've got the high watermark of authoritarianism under Xi Jinping. But throw forward 20, 30 years. Is that going to be the same when you have a much larger percentage of the Chinese population that has been born into affluence and will want to save their lives? So we should not, in looking at the relationship between China and the US, we have to look at the pressures bearing on both countries. And the pressures bearing on China in demography and the inevitable denouement in relation to authoritarianism and greater liberty are probably greater than are bearing on the United States, and the inherent capacities of that country to renew and its technological mastery are going to continue to stick to it. We will come out of the current political phase in the US. Countries go through phases. If you think the current situation in the US is difficult, I can remember the decade of the 1960s. It was a horror decade for the United States. And many people said, you're going to get all sorts of problems, but they'll never solve them, but they did. And so I remain an optimist. I'm somebody who rejects totally this idea that America has entered a period of decline and that some kind of showdown between America and China is inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's possible. But I think if we bear in mind the inhibiting factors China has, the situation is a lot brighter than many people give the Americans credit for.
Just coming back to Wendy Cutler for a moment. Wendy, the president, by executive order, removed the special status of Hong Kong just a few days ago. And Hong Kong was, after, Australia has the second largest trade deficit with the United States. So the US has its second largest trade surplus is actually with Australia, but the largest trade surplus, I think, was with Hong Kong. And part of that was linked to the special status of Hong Kong. The president set the benchmark of trade surpluses and trade deficits as an indicator of whether there were fair trade deals. And this is a completely, a very significant setback for Hong Kong. Do you see other nations in Asia helping to fill the gap? And what role can Australia play in helping to encourage the United States to continue to grow its trade and investment relationships across Asia?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this administration has, as you've mentioned, they're measuring and assessing our trade relationships based on, our trade, whether we have a trade deficit or trade surplus. And when you look at, our total trade with Asia, it kind of remains the same, but, things move around depending on where restrictions have been placed. So for example, with Vietnam now, our trade deficit with Vietnam is increasing dramatically. Well, a lot of that's just a result of a lot of companies now moving to Vietnam to get out of China, to move their supply chains. So I think that, that whole approach towards trade and what's fair and unfair shouldn't be, based on a trade deficit or a trade surplus. Now, for Australia, it's great that we have a trade surplus with you. I think it's kept you out of the line of fire. But I think it is unfortunate that has become, kind of a litmus test. Although with time, you do notice that the administration talks about the trade deficit a lot less, because I think they realize, like other USTRs I've worked for, that you can do tons of trade agreements. You can open up lots of markets and you still might have a trade deficit. So you don't want that to be the marker on whether you've succeeded or failed.
Arthur Sinodinos, in your previous role as Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister and with your extensive experience in Treasury, are we missing something in failing to prosecute the case that tariffs are in fact taxes on your own people? I mean, have we just got so caught up in the weeds of arguing about digital economy and everything else that the instruments being used by people in order to prosecute a case are in fact hurting the people that they're meant to support?
Yeah, actually, Joe, that's a great question, because listening to Bob Zellick before talk about political leadership, I think political leaders need to be given the tools to do the job. And one of the tools is to be able to explain exactly what you just said, that these tariffs have costs on your own people. And there's been some debate of that here in the US, and in talking with the administration, they've tended to say, yes, but these costs aren't as big as people think, or it's at the margin and all the rest of it. Well, I think the costs, as you no doubt from your own previous experiences would know, these costs end up being larger than you think. And often they're dynamic costs, not just the cost at a point in time, but it's the impact that tariffs have in creating industries that are inward looking or fragmented. And so I think a lot of it is just information and analytical tools. And I think here in the States, what I think has happened is you've had parts of the population who've missed out on the benefits of globalization because of either the occupation the industry or the region they're in. And they're the sort of group that saw someone like Donald Trump in 2016 who was saying to them, I can sort of restore, if you like, a version of the great American dream of the 50s and 60s, because we'll make things here like we used to. And in a funny way, there's a thread from that right through to today, where you've got these protesters on the streets who are often people who are marginalized, who or whatever, are feeling the impacts of inequality. So I think part of it is, as Bob Zellick was alluding to, you build a constituency by explaining to people what it is that's affecting them and what are the best tools to help them go forward. Always create a coalition of the willing, a group of stakeholders who are going to work together to get an outcome. And here in the States, Joe, as you found in your time and I'm finding, there are groups in the business community who understand the impacts of these things very well. And I think we all just need to be arguing the case and explaining to people what the economic costs really are.
Michael Thorley, has low inflation given political leaders a get out of jail free card to argue for tariffs and quotas?
Well, it's certainly given us a get out of jail free card for borrowing and for investing at a time when we badly need to invest. But Joe, I'd just like to pick up, I don't disagree with what people are saying at all, but I mean, trade is highly political, and you've got to move in the area where the politics lets you move and in the forums that they let you move, and they vary from time to time. We always wanted multilateral agreements, but nothing was happening after the Seattle debacle under the Clinton administration, so we moved bilaterally. I think Wendy makes an interesting point here. I mean, when looking at regional and agreements and sort of coalitions of the willing, especially at a time when governments dealing with populist pressures, anti-globalization views, and looking to create national resilience as a consequence, the people are more focused on that as a consequence of the coronavirus and the shortages we've had, and on industry policy generally. So the question is, how do governments do this in a way which we all want to? I mean, there's no country in the world which isn't talking like this. So we need a more effective investment. We need an industry policy, not sort of tariffs and protection so much, but we need to create growth at home, and we need to make sure that our economies have a breadth of capacity and capabilities. And so we're talking about an industry policy. So it seems to me that what we should be looking at is, how do we work together with countries in a way that these things are the least damaging, and actually look for opportunities to make these things more multilateral or regional. And in particular on investments, I wanted to pick up a point here, which is, I think, that reminds me that we need to think very carefully about unintended consequences. As Wendy points out, we've redone our FIRB rules, and the US has redone its CFIUS rules, and the Europeans have done the same. And everyone's too polite to sort of mention it, but basically we're worried about one particular country sort of moving in a big way, and so people are looking to restrict foreign investment. But as someone who works for a major long-term investor abroad, what this means is that it's actually more difficult. These rules make it more difficult for us to invest. And what this means is that if you have a system which restricts investments by long-term institutional investors who basically have no strings, no other agenda in mind other than long-term income or growth for their investors, often their clients, often retirement funds and so on, then actually what you're doing is you're restricting the opportunity of diversifying your investor base, and you're actually leaving yourself more exposed to the very countries or operators that you're trying to cut out. And that's because we tend to introduce rules on a sort of a non-discriminatory basis, because we don't want to say what we're really trying to prevent. So it's just a caution, I think, about some of these measures that we that it'd be far better if we could look at these things on a regional basis amongst like-minded countries who have the same objectives and understand the reality of economic growth, and that tariffs and restrictions have to be very carefully defined if they're not going to be counterproductive.
Well, on that point, and it's a good point, because we now are tending to weaponize foreign investment rules in order to try and get the outcome. I plead guilty. I was the first to reject a major American investment in Australia, Archer Daniels buying GrainCorp. And little did I know there was a secret agreement between Bob Zoellick and Mark Vaile. And it was in fact the Obama White House that told us about it. But that's, you can't always trust the people on your own side, I've found, in these certain circumstances. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to the panel. We are keeping to a strict timetable, and it is as much a celebration as it is a statement about hope for the future, that we can continue to grow this amazing relationship between the United States and Australia. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Joe. That was such an excellent, informative discussion. I hope those viewing and listening in will join me in a virtual round of applause. There is no doubt that we are currently living in a time that is the most complex and uncertain of any generation that has lived during the past 70 or 80 years. The confluence of three significant factors have caused and shaped this complexity and uncertainty. Firstly, the re-emergence and recent acceleration of great power rivalry and friction over the past decade. Secondly, the global impact of an unconventional US administration which seeks to recalibrate and rebalance the country's domestic needs with its pivotal global leadership role. Although it may be unsettling to those who see this as something new and unexpected, US volatility has and does occur, albeit infrequently, and is not without precedent over the course of the country's history. Thirdly, and most recently and surprisingly, the terrible health and economic impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having and will continue to have for the foreseeable future right across the globe. To put this in some context, it was only 4 years ago that many considered that the most significant disruption of global geoeconomics and politics was going to be Brexit. Today, that issue hardly rates a footnote. In times of hyper-complexity and uncertainty, there is a real benefit in focusing on some of the foundational underpinnings of why our respective countries have for so long remained secure, prosperous, and open societies. Many describe these simply as our shared values. Free trade is one of those foundations, and it is therefore very important to understand its role in maintaining our peace and prosperity. It is against that background that the US Studies Centre has hosted today's event, celebrating the 15th anniversary of the commencement of the US Australian Free Trade Agreement. Today's discussion could not have been provided by a group of more highly qualified and authoritative voices on the subject matter. The focus during the first part of the panel on the historic context of the FTA, the trials and tribulations of its negotiation and implementation, the war stories, if you like, provided insight into issues at a very strategic level, which provided the impetus for the agreement to come into existence. These are valuable learnings today as policymakers and more generally society tries to navigate its way through a highly complex economic environment. That provided an extremely relevant backdrop to the second part of the panel, which focused on forward-looking issues relating to free trade and the current impediments and potential pathways which exist for its continued expansion. The message I'm taking away from today's discussion is that the 15-year-old US-Australian Free Trade Agreement was a magnificent and consequential agreement, providing material mutual benefits to both countries, and it provides a tremendous foundation on which to continue to build the relationship. As outlined by Arthur and Wendy, there are many important areas of cooperation, collaboration, and coordination which should be continued to be focused on by both countries. A couple of other areas that could be added to the list are better harmonisation of our respective capital markets, and once resumed, more streamlined travel access. And we all hope that happens as soon as prudently possible. In this way, we can continue to build a closer economic relationship between our two nations, and in doing so, underpin our collective peace and prosperity. On behalf of the US Studies Centre and the people who are currently viewing, I would sincerely like to thank the panel participants today. Former Prime Minister, the Honourable John Howard, Bob Zoellick, Wendy Cutler, and my good friend, former Ambassador Michael Thorley. Also, I'd like to thank and acknowledge for his excellent role as moderator, former Ambassador, the Honourable Joe Hockey, and for his valuable introductory comments and participation, current Ambassador, the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos. You have all truly provided us with unparalleled insights and learnings today. Thank you. We are honoured by your willingness to participate, especially those who are based in the US who are now well into their usual dinner time. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the message of support received from Prime Minister Morrison and Ambassador Culverhouse. In addition, I would like to acknowledge and thank the events communications teams at the Centre, led very capably by Janine Pinto and Marie Koch, for their hard work in ensuring this event has run as smoothly and as well attended as it is. It is especially pleasing to have Messrs Howard, Thorley and Sinodinos with us today, as they were part of the leadership group within the Howard government that facilitated the establishment of the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney through the contribution of a $25 million grant to the American Australian Association. The AAA, as it is known, was responsible for the original idea of establishing the Studies Centre, focused on the US located in Australia. Its purpose to educate Australians about the breadth, depth and importance of our relationship with the US. It is therefore appropriate that I acknowledge the presence on the webinar today of Craig Chapman and Ambassador John Berry, retired, both Chairman and President of the AAA Inc., based in New York, respectively, and the Honourable John Olson, Chairman of both the AAA Limited, based in Sydney, and the Perth US Asia Centre, the Ussc sister centre based in Western Australia. In addition, Gordon Flake, CEO of the Perth US Asia Centre, is also with us today. I'd like to thank the AAA and the University of Sydney as joint venture partners oversighting the activities of the centre for their foresight and ongoing support of the USSC. I would also like to thank the AAA and the Perth US Asia Centre for their support and promotion of today's events. I understand there are hundreds of registered participants from both the US and Western Australia. Can I also say how pleased I am that Joe Hockey has agreed to become a Distinguished Ambassadorial Fellow for the USSC. Welcome and thank you, Joe. I'd now like to share some further brief background on the USSC. The Centre was established in 2006, so almost as old as the FTA. Its mission is to rigorously analyse the United States, provide Australians with a balanced view of the US, and an opportunity to learn and gain insight into what is undoubtedly our most important strategic ally. It also exists to strengthen the US-Australian relationship. As our tagline states, analysis of America, insight for Australia. The Centre implements its mission by being research focused, but this is also significantly supported by teaching undertaken by the Centre's faculty at the University of Sydney across a range of US-related subjects, and also our ability to convene events such as today's. Its mission has allowed the Centre during its 14-year history to educate over 9,000 students, author more than 1,000 journal articles, research reports, opinion pieces and books, and convene in excess of 1,000 events with tens of thousands of attendees. Finally, why should we study the US? I simply say we study it because we can and we want to, not because we must and have to. In that light, I would commend to you our upcoming events, which are outlined on our website, www.ussc.edu.au. Thank you for your attendance, and I look forward to you participating in future events hosted by the Centre.